Hello, I am Sophie welcome back to my channel, and welcome to a video that I made about 3 years ago that I wanted to make an updated version of because 3 years is a long time, okay? It was overdue. And that video is my writing processes. How I go through each step in the writing process. Yeah, because of what I've been writing lately, this one is more of my writing process, but for series and for later drafts in the writing process. Not so much like how I come up with new stories, how I do like zero drafting. There is a little bit of zero drafting in here, but it's more focused on the zero drafts of like a book 2 in a series, a book 3 in a series, instead of like a fresh, whole new story zero draft. Yeah. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Cool. Good intro. This is going to be a long one as well because I scripted this. It is so long. So brace yourselves. And if I have props, I will bring the props, but we'll just see as we go through the script. So, step 1 in the story making process. Scrapping together ideas. Bringing stuff together that I've already thought about and trying to mold it into a coherent story. When I think about this, I think about this in the same way that like a star is formed. The slow accumulation of material until something brilliant comes out. A star. Incredible power, incredible light. That's what getting the story idea together feels like to me. And for me, that whole thing is just slowly building up what I know about this story. For the most part, the biggest thing that I get is world building. I will get that first and foremost pretty much every time. Knowing the world sets up the constraints of what can happen in that world, what my characters can do in that world, and what can happen in the story in that sense. So world building is the main thing that I can get right off the bat. You probably already know that if you watched any of my other videos. But alongside that, it's also just bringing together plot points that I would want to see in the book, trying to find their position in the overall plot so I could just fill in the gaps around it, and also just like character design, world design, like actual drawings and stuff beyond like writing out the world building. All of that I sort of put in this category of bringing the story together before actually outlining, before actually drafting, before actually having a real whole story. Also in this time, a lot of visuals are being made, like I already said, character design, world design, drawing a lot of things, getting the creative juices flowing. I am a very visual person. So having a visual depiction of something that's going to be in the story makes it so much easier to add to the story when I'm actually writing because I have something to base my descriptions off of. My brain is not very good at keeping a hold of an image of something I make up in my head. It needs to be drawn. It needs to happen. That's my weakness. But I do have a solution, and that is either making a full detailed drawing of something or just sketching it out before I describe it to make sure I have what I'm trying to envision in my head correct. Yeah, lots of visuals when it comes to drawing, also like Pinterest boards, mood boards, anything that like represents the story visually, I'm also collecting here. Also just collecting over time. Like my Project What Pinterest board is pretty big now, and I just keep adding to it every time I go onto Pinterest. I'm like, oh, that reminds me of Project What, and I'll just add it. Even though I'm not working on the story right now. It's fine. That's what it's there for. And on the topic of character and world design, I feel like my video about Project Star is a very good representation of how that goes down for me. For pretty much all world building design and world design, it starts my sketchbook. I have to start physically, which I can grab that. World design starts in here. My cute little sketchbook that I've used like 20 pages out of in the past year and a half. Don't hit me up. This is for Project Star. You've probably seen this before if you've watched that other world building video. More for Project Star. If that even shows up on camera, I apologize if it doesn't. And I also have some stuff in here for Project Glass, which it's a horror novel, so prepare yourselves. Not that these are particularly scary, but they do have horror tones because I was designing the creature that they fight, that they are fighting against, but they're trying to escape because they don't want to turn into one of these people. But world design definitely always starts on paper. I feel like I can be looser on paper for some reason. Like, there's no real constraints in a sketchbook. When I go to digital, that is when things are getting serious. I've got my final ideas, or I'm tweaking minor areas that I didn't really know how to fix. Like, for these guys, I could not for the life of me figure out how I wanted to draw their tail. So I had to go to the digitals to figure that out. But for the most part, all the brainstorming is happening in here. The final drawings are being made digitally. And on those digital drawings, I'll add a bunch of little notes that I come up with either while I'm drawing or beforehand, or honestly after, I'll just add them. But I like the look of like a diagram, a biological diagram or something. It could be seen in a textbook or someone's notes or something. I do like that look, where it's just like drawings, and then there's a bunch of descriptions and a bunch of little arrows pointing to everything. That's a lot of fun for me. But that is the world design steps that I tend to take. Also, maps and stuff. I haven't made a map in a while because all the worlds I'm in already have maps, so I don't have to worry about that. Maps as well, for a little while, I do remember making them in my sketchbook or on paper first, and then moving to drawing them digitally. But like I said, I haven't made a map in a while because I'm working in Project What, which has had a map since the beginning, Project Glass, which has had a map since the beginning, and Project Star, which we don't really need a map because they're in so many different places for so little time each that it just does not make sense to make a map for it. But map process, also trying to get like vague outline, vague shape on paper before moving to digital and actually finalizing what I want the world to look like. But yeah, world design. And then character design is slightly different. I don't tend to do like straight up character design, trying to get the facial features perfect and like what I see as my characters in my sketchbook. That does not work out. Do not even hit me up. If I have like just an urge to draw a character that I don't really need to be super accurate, or I'm getting like a super vague idea of what I want this character to look like, it might go in the sketchbook. But if I'm aiming for a near perfect representation of what the character looks like in my head, we're going straight to digital. We gotta go straight in. My method for this is, hopefully, if I did my homework, I would already have Pinterest pins in the Pinterest board, yeah, that are a bunch of different faces, a bunch of different portraits for each character that I think represents some kind of feature for the character well. So like one portrait, I might be like, oh, that's like a perfect nose. Or like a second one would be like, oh, that's her eyes. Or like, that's his mouth. Or that's his hair or something. It's not all one person. And I just swipe through all of them, get all the references that I want, and mush them together into the person that I think is my character. So if you ever see my Pinterest boards and there are like people that don't look anything close to each other, or maybe they look kind of close, but it's like, this could not represent the same character. It does, technically. It's just specific features that I'm taking from each person. But yeah, I'll Frankenstein those people together, sketch up my character. I'll just kind of make a headshot of them, because that's really what I need. So far, so good. I have all the main characters for the Project What trilogy done, which I adore. I think I made a video about that. And I have one of my main characters done for Project Star. They are so hard to draw. Both of those main characters are so hard to draw. I love them, but it's a struggle. The one portrait took multiple days to try and figure out and make sure it looked okay. I haven't even attempted the second one yet, but someday. Anyways, that's character and world design. Very important to me. Not necessary for most people, I would think, especially if you don't draw or you don't like to draw, but I do, and I need the visual representation. So that's a big part of the process for me. Now, for series, in this step, this whole bringing it together, it's pretty much the same, except that we have new constraints for the story. Constraints and context and consequences to what the main characters already did in the previous book or books. So when trying to pull together a book 2 or a book 3, there's a lot more looking back at what had already happened in the books before it, making sure that my characters don't step out of line or get some sort of like deus ex machina kind of deal in the next books, and that the decisions that they already made mattered, and they keep mattering. Is that a word? mattering when trying to come up with sequels. Definitely looking at that, especially because most of the world building, most of the character building is already done. That we don't have to look at that as much. Obviously, like in other books, you are introducing new things, but the baseline, the foundation of your world and your project is already there. So when series come around, really just making sure that I have the full context for the world and also what has already happened in our narrative. And honestly, this step in the process is done when I feel like it. When I think that it's ready to outline. At a certain point, I feel like I have enough information to mush together into an outline. A lot of this is connecting what I've said in the many different mediums I have taken notes on. If you remember Project Moss, I had a digital project notebook for that, which frankly was a mess. I don't know how I ended up organizing that, but that was just a bunch of lists of like world building and sort of what my characters were going through different arcs because of what they did in book one. And it was not organized in a way that was to flow through an actual story. It was like, here is one chunk of the story that we're following. Here's another chunk of the story that we're following. Here's some stuff that they learn in this book, blah, 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 blah. And then after I had built up a ton of that, I was like, oh, I think I have enough information here to actually outfit an outline. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Sometimes I'm wrong and we have to go back to the drawing board and start over. Or, tweak a little bit, add a little bit. But for the most part, really just a feeling. It's also how much I know in my head, because some stuff I don't really write down, especially like, oh, this is how the character is feeling. This is what drives her to go here instead of there. Like, that's just in my head. I know what they're going to do because they're my characters. Yeah, I really don't know how to describe it. It's like in my brain, I'm fully immersed in the world at this point. I know more than I've written down simply because like I'm a part of this world in a sense, because I've been so deep in it for that period of time that I'm like, yeah, it's time to go. I'm fully immersed. I have a ton of information. It's time to move on. It's time to start outlining. And that is not to say that I don't keep world building past this point, or keep character building, or keep mood boarding or anything. Obviously, those go on forever. I feel like that's the writer's curse. But at this point, it does become a sort of back burner thing as we get to actually writing the story, or outlining it, turning it into a booklet structure. Okay, so outlining is pretty much, we're still in the pull everything together slowly stage, just with a little bit more guidance, a little bit more structure. You can see this process very clearly in my Project Star outlining vlog, which I will link, where I was literally putting sticky notes on the back of my bedroom door and then slowly refining that into something that had a little more detail, something that actually had a flow to it that I could follow. And I will also have another outlining video for Project Star Book 3 out very soon after this one that I think shows more of the tougher end of outlining for me, or at least when outlines do not want to work with me. But we're not talking about that here. That'll be out soon. So at the very beginning, my outlines are literally just events I want to happen in the story, or that I think logically would happen in the story. Once again, very much motivated by context, consequences, constraints, the 3 C's. I mean, the first book is more of what I want to happen, what the characters do in these situations. Book 1 is pretty open, thankfully for what I've been working on recently. The first book of each series that I have been working on, the two series I've already been outlined. So that I did not have to worry about. I had a basic idea of what book 1 was going to be for Project Star. Obviously, Project What has been in the thick of it forever, so I know about that story. But for book 2, book 3, the events are very restricted to what they've done in book 1, what kind of enemies they've made in book 1, what kind of state the world around them is in at the end of book 1. So trying to find events that would make sense in those contexts is really what's going on at the very beginning of my outlining. Alongside this, a lot of the first things I get when outlining are emotional points I want my characters to hit. More specifically, like parts of their arc that are lowest and highest. This is where my character feels lowest. This is where she is the lowest. She feels like there's no way back. no way around this, something like that. Or like we see, oh, and then this is where this other character is at his highest, where he feels unstoppable and then he gets crushed in the next scene. Sometimes I have those points that I want to emphasize for sure. Like, I might not even know what scene crushes said character that's at his high point, but it's like, that needs to happen. He needs to be his high point, he needs to be crushed. That's all I know. Also, relationship arcs. Those need to happen, especially in Project Star, where it's supposed to be a slow burn romance. Even though that's not really happening in the story, that needs to be added. If I do know something like that, specifically, like especially for Project Star, where I know what points the relationship needs to be at throughout the trilogy, I will note those as well. Obviously, I won't follow it, apparently, but but they will be noted and they will be put in the bare bones outline, which, if you've heard me say bare bones outline before, this is what I mean. It's the most basic idea I have of a story before I actually lock in and start trying to figure out what's happening. But now that I have my basic idea, which in the case of Project Star was the wall of sticky notes, it is time to start filling everything in. You should probably know here that I don't use the Save the Cat beat structure anymore. At least I don't follow it beat by beat by beat and make sure that I'm following it, like, not rigidly, but like specifically. I found a sort of story structure that I can use myself that I feel like is still loosely based off Save the Cat, since Save the Cat is a generalization of what happens commonly in stories. So it's a pattern you're gonna follow anyways, but I don't specifically seek out filling in the 15 beats, though I do use their terminology still because it is very useful and most people know it, so it makes it easy to communicate what's happening. Anyways, back to filling out the outline. On one of the streams, we were talking about outlining, and I was talking about how I sort of come up with my outlines and what my thought process is during that, and someone had a great way of describing it. I wish I had the original comment, but it went something like this. The way I try to approach it is like directing my characters. I'm a director, they're my actors, and it's more collaborative. I know that sounds crazy because my characters aren't real. It's in the sense that they take shape in my brain and have their own identity, in a sense, in my brain that gives me the chance to do this sort of collaboration. I probably sound crazy. Give me a second. Essentially what it is trying to figure out how my characters would react to each event that I have already built up in the bare bones outline, and seeing how their reaction would lead to their action, and see how they would dance through the story given how they would feel, how they would react, how everything that's built up would affect my characters and affect how they drive the story forward after each event. And really, the bare bones are like probably 3 or 4 big events that happen in the book. This whole directing thing is really helpful in trying to fill in the gaps. Pretty much 80% of the story is still up in the air, probably 90%. Just trying to figure out where emotionally the characters are, or like based on what they now know, what they would do with that information, or like how they would act knowing they have a new route to take in the story, makes it very much easier to try and figure out and to build an outline that makes sense, because your characters are supposed to drive your story. You know what I mean? Obviously, you need to have plot points in there that maybe they don't entirely control, but knowing that they do have a handle on what they're doing and that there's not just some plot god being like, no, go that way, and that it makes logical sense for a character to take a certain path or to make a certain decision or something. Very important, very crucial. So that whole idea that like when I'm outlining, I'm directing my characters through a story and trying to see how they would work in the story, what they would do. Very accurate. Shout out to whoever made that comment. I'm sorry, I don't remember. That was a great way of putting it. Thank you. And especially for series, like I already said, context, constraints, consequences. We are considering all of that and trying to see what even is possible for my characters to do in this world. Like just keeping it as logical as possible, so there's not just some random idea that's like, oh, let's go destroy a planet or something. Like, what? No, you can't do that. Sorry. Don't think about that again. But out of what the characters can do, what is physically possible in the world, which one would they pick? So now that we've narrowed it down to what can they do, we need to figure out what will they do. You feel me? So my outlines are basically just one big line of a logical, most likely outcome given my characters and their personalities and, you know, what they would do. And then the consequences of those outcomes, especially in the world context, and then repeat. What would the character do? What are the consequences of what the character did? How does that affect the world? Now what are they gonna do? What are the consequences? Over and over and over again. Which, you know, is a story. I know I'm definitely not the first person to say that, but that's literally how I see it. It's the most boiled down basic form of how I outline is character action, consequence, context in the world, start over. Just keep going until the end. And filling in those gaps that I've already established in the bare bones outline. Sometimes, because of how characters act, I do have to change those points that I've already come up with, but that doesn't happen very often, thankfully. I feel like at the point where I do deem a story ready to be outlined, I know pretty much how I want the characters to act and feel at certain points in the story, where plot points tend to make sense even after I've fleshed out the outline. Sometimes that's not true. Book 2 of Project Star got changed quite a bit, simply because of how I changed my female main character's fun and games, I guess. She went on a much more violent arc in the fun and games than I thought she would, and that changed a good chunk of the ending of Book 2. But yeah, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. It does tend to work out more often than it doesn't though, which is nice. As you probably already know, my outlining comes in many shapes and forms. There is no one way that I end up brainstorming an outline. They always end up, well, always. In most cases, as in like 95% of cases, they end up in cards. Here's an example. Here is one I'm currently working on. This is book 3 of Project Star. And then these are book 1 and book 2. They are very chunky boys. This is a trilogy. This is a fully outlined zero draft of a trilogy. The colors mean things. They mean different things every time. For a while, when I was using Save the Cat, the yellow was the actual beats, the 15 beats. Red was conflict. Blue was character arcs. Purple was relationship arcs. And green, I don't know what green was. I don't know what green was. I think green probably was something like context as well, since that's a huge thing for me. Green was probably context, white was everything else. So if I had a specific scene that I already knew I needed, if I had just a side note that I wanted to add, just so I remembered what I was doing, that's what it used to be. Now it's just whatever I need for the project gets organized into those 6 colors, well, 5 colors plus white. White is always just everything else that doesn't get categorized. Like for Project Star, purple is character arcs, red is other species that we see in the project since we're in space with a lot of aliens. Yellow is context, blue is world building, like anything else other than species world building, just other world building notes that I need to orient myself in the world. And green is location. So if we need to be at a specific location for a certain point in the story, I'll introduce it with a green little card. But that's for Project Star. Very cute. This is the outcome. This is the final draft, I guess, of an outline before I start drafting. That is typically my default, this is what I need to know, medium are the cards. And then sometimes for more detailed outlines, especially for like Project What, I think that's the only one I've really done this in before. But if it does need more detail, if I do want to be more specific and I have something more concrete in my head that needs to happen, typically it's in a further draft where I have the scene already written, but there's specific changes that need to be made. I will make a bullet point list for it instead, where it'll be like a Google Docs, like literally like notes list that chronicles the whole thing. For Project What Draft 3, I had a bullet point list instead of plot cards, because at that point there was so much detail that I wanted to make sure was there that I had to be put in bullet points. So sometimes if it needs more detail, it will be in bullet points, but that is most likely only for later drafts, which I only have one of so far. Project What. Anyways, now that the outline is done, probably in cards, most likely, pretty much 100% it will be in cards. but it is time to start drafting. And that begins with a zero draft. Technically a first draft, but in the way that I use the first draft, it's pretty much a detailed outline. So I don't feel right calling it a first draft. It feels more right being called a zero draft. If it was solid enough, I could call it a first draft. Like Project Glass didn't have a zero draft. That was a first draft. I feel like it had a solid start, as well as Project What, even though that story's changed so much since the first draft. But those two are pretty much the only ones that had first drafts only, no zero draft. But nowadays, zero drafts just make my process go by smoother. It makes figuring out the story so much easier. So zero drafts are here to stay. And I think about it like this. The zero draft is like the first pancake you put in the pan when you're making pancakes, okay? It's gonna be ugly, it's gonna suck. You're probably just gonna throw it away or eat it while you're cooking the other ones that are gonna turn out way better. So, this is like your sacrificial draft. Your sacrificial pancake. Yeah, in this draft as well is where I typically learn the most about my characters. I know I was talking about like, oh, this is how I would direct the characters. I know the characters pretty well. Like my outline was understanding the characters and knowing how they would react to fuel the story. When I'm drafting, I feel like I learn more about the characters themselves beyond their motivations, their actions. Through drafting, I get to learn so much more about what the characters are made of. In Project Star, my female main character in book 2 made a drastic turn that I was not expecting because of how I had written her in book 1 and in book 2 up to that point, to that drastic turn. It had just almost necessitated this change. So yeah, definitely learning a lot more about the characters influences how they act in the story, and sometimes there needs to be change. But for the most part, it's usually just adding to what we know about the characters. Another Project Star moment, I learned more about my male main character when finishing book 2 that solidified more what his established motivation already was. It made it deeper. It made it feel more real and a little more tragic. And I didn't know that until I got to the end of that arc, which I thought was awesome. But it gave me a good thing to build into book 1 to make book 2 feel more substantial, more tragic, more, I don't know, just more, just make it feel more. But outside of each draft, I don't really develop my characters very much, as in like on paper developing them, like in character sheets with character questions, that kind of thing. It just does not work for me. It makes me feel like my characters have been dulled down. You're technically making them more complex by answering these questions and putting it down on paper, but every time I try to do it, I just feel like my characters are being just boiled down to whatever I write down when they are so much more in my head. So I don't I don't physically actually like develop my characters on paper, but they do develop in each draft. I feel like they do evolve, they do become something more. It honestly just remains in the drafts. It remains in the drafts, it remains in my head. Sometimes it's mentioned in the outlines and stuff, but there's never like a character sheet or like a character document that I end up filling out. And I've tried. Trust me, I've tried. But these drafts do not take very long, at least relative to like their subsequent drafts, which can take years to finish, or at least probably on average like a year or 2. But zero drafts typically take about 2 months, I would say. Some of them are done in 1. Project Star has been going very well, where I've kept it at about a draft a month, which is incredible. I would say that typically it does take around 2 months, longest probably 4 or 5. But these drafts are literally just me putting some idea of the story down on paper, and it's not all fluffy, it's not all fun, there's not a ton of good prose. It's probably not any good prose, not gonna lie. It doesn't take that long. Its purpose is to get the ball rolling, get the story down, give me something to work off of. And I am also an insane underwriter. So these drafts typically end up being super short. Usually they don't go over 40K. My 2 biggest were Project What and Project Star the first time around. Those ones leveled off around 48,000 words, 46 to 48. Those have always been my biggest. I have not gone over that. Though maybe I have in Project Moss. I have no idea. That one is all handwritten though, so we may never know. We may never know. That one does feel kind of large. It could be around like 30K though. honestly. Because I can be like, oh, wow, this story is so big and so vast. And then I'll look at the word count, it's like 27,000. Anyways, moving on into revision. And not gonna lie, I don't really have a set method for this either. It's really just up to what the story needs. And like I mentioned, I have been handwriting quite a bit lately. I handwrote Project Moss and I handwrote Project Glass in their entireties. Those two books, their drafts are completely handwritten. So that necessitated a change somewhat in how I revise. What I've been doing, what I did for those two drafts is just picked out a pen color that I associate with the project and annotated my handwritten words, and then had a separate notebook or a separate page or something that I was putting most of the notes on, because in those notebooks there's not a ton of margin space. You kind of have to squeeze your annotations in there. So having a separate notebook or like a separate sheet, I think for Project Moss I put all my revision notes in the digital notebook, but having that separate notebook where everything actually is makes it so much easier. But that is for my handwritten books. I have gone back to writing digitally again, so just a little bit different now. Typically, when I do end up revising for any draft, any step, I do end up printing it out. I need that medium switch. I cannot for the life of me, like, read critically and like fully grasp what's happening if it's digital, especially on my laptop. It's slightly better if I'm on my iPad, but printing out makes it so much more effective. So typically when I'm done with a draft, I'll print it out, color code my highlighters, of course, color code my notes, of course, and pick out a little pen to annotate with, typically like red, so it stands out. I have not done that in a while. Like I said, my last two drafts were handwritten, and I will not be revising Project Star for a while. For a long, long while. But beforehand, when I was drafting more digitally and revising more, that was definitely how it went. Typically for this, unless it's a big change, I will keep all my notes in the actual draft, on top of the actual draft in the annotations. Unless it's a huge change that needs to be done for the plot, or like it's a major part of the story, I'll put that in separate notes. But for the most part, it stays on the document. And for zero draft revision, I am just looking at big picture ideas. We're not looking at the specifics. I'm really just trying to make sure that the outline as a whole, the outline that I've come up with, the story that I've created, I just want to make sure that it flows. I just want to make sure that it does look and act like a story, one that is usable to keep working on in the future. And alongside that, what part of the story actually contributes to the story and what is unnecessary. It's literally just the biggest picture items and trying to make the story worth reading, in a sense. Also, characterization. Characterization is a big thing. Like I already said, I don't develop my characters beyond the drafts, so making sure that that does happen when I am drafting and when I am revising is very important. But that's pretty much revision. It's very simple, especially in the zero draft stage, because all I'm looking at is making sure I have something close to a story, something workable. But let's move on to draft one and beyond. So lately, as I have been developing later drafts beyond the zero draft for multiple stories, I have realized that each time I start a draft or I write a draft, I'm focusing on only certain aspects of the story, certain problems of each story, or I mean like at least a few at a time, but definitely not every problem that I notice. For example, Project What, Draft 2, I was very focused on fleshing out the world and the enemy group that they are fighting against, which ended up creating a super beefy, convoluted story that needed to be cut down severely. That got fixed in Draft 3, because Draft 3, pretty much my main concern was streamlining the story. I felt like the information that I provided in Draft 2 was good, just the way the characters went through the story and how it was conveyed was super weird, and so many unnecessary scenes. So Draft 3 was definitely keeping the information that we learn and keeping what we know, but just making it more to the point. We were actually getting through the story. And then for Project Glass, I've only written Draft 2, but Draft 2, I was really focusing on world building and neglected characterization heavy, at least representing characterization in the actual writing, because we needed the world building. We needed the world building, we needed the backstory. I really wanted to establish us in this sort of small town horror vibe. But for draft 3, I'm hoping the main focus will be characterization, because that's really the biggest glaring problem that I see in the draft so far. But anyways, so far for these subsequent drafts, they have all been complete rewrites. Draft 2 of Project What was a complete rewrite of Draft 1, especially because Draft 1 had none of the enemy group that I established for Draft 2, and it just needed to be beefed up, which it was beefed up. It was probably 4 times as big as Draft 1, which is so funny to me. And then same thing again for Draft 3, complete rewrite. If you were here for that, you know the hodgepodge Frankenstein's monster that Project What became before it became Draft 3. Yeah, both times they were pretty much complete rewrites. Maybe Project What, I kept a couple scenes, but not much. Project Glass, complete rewrite. I didn't even reference the original draft much because I wanted just a fresh start, because I wrote the first draft in like 2020, and I don't need to see that, you know what I mean? But that is not to say that they will be complete rewrites forever. I'm pretty sure Draft 3 of Project What is gonna stay pretty much the same. There are some points in there that I do need to change, for sure, that I already know about, but the rest of it, gonna stay the same. Again, can I reiterate that my whole process is just a slow, patient refining every time, the whole time. It's seeing what works in the moment, reflecting, refining, starting over. That's it, the whole time, all day, forever. But I do not have a ton of experience in this, obviously. The only projects that have following drafts after their original draft are Project What and Project Glass right now. And I guess technically Project Star, but I don't count it too much. But yeah, those are really the only 2 that have drafts after their first draft. Yeah, I do not have a ton of experience with this whole later draft process, but I have noticed that there's like at max 2 or 3 big issues that I can work on during each draft that'll actually get done, that'll actually get fixed. I can pretend that I'll be able to fix all of them. Like, I'll be aware of all the issues that I have for a draft. Or maybe I won't be. Honestly, maybe I won't be. But sometimes I will be aware of things that need to be tweaked and done. And not all of them will happen, no matter how hard I try. Or how hard I don't try, honestly. Sometimes I'll get so focused in on some other problems that I don't even realize that I haven't fixed the other one at all. It's cool. It's really fun. It's awesome to discover. Anyways, now let's focus a little bit more on series themselves. I am extremely new to this process. If you were here many years ago, probably 2, I think 2, then you know about my Project Quest, which was a 4-book fantasy series that I had technically written the 2nd book of before giving up. Before giving up on that project. But I don't really count that as my first, like, proper sequel written, because those first 2 books were technically the first book that I wrote for that project, split into 2, and then rewritten. My real proper attempt, successful attempt, I should say, I consider to be Project Moss. And since then, I have written the 2nd book in Project Star as well, and I am currently working on the 3rd book in Project Star. So yeah, very new to this. Those are my only 2 series projects right now. Everything else I'm writing currently, or like considering writing, have been standalones. So this is really the only 2 chances I have right now of truly understanding this process. But here's what I have learned so far. So like I've been saying this entire time, the 3 C's: context, constraints, consequences. So big for me. So big for me. I want stories to sound logical, or be logical, and I don't want to give my characters unnecessary plot armor or unrealistic plot armor. That peeves me so much. Not even just in drafting, but like in reading other people's books as well, just like knowing that the characters just got plot armor just cause. It really pulls you out of the whole thing, and I want to avoid that in my own writing, because if it is in my own writing, I'll stop writing the book altogether. I feel like it's happened before where I've had to figure out a workaround in order to keep my book going, because I didn't want to write in some stupid little plot armor Deus Ex Machina deal. Because I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. It makes me feel dumb. So, especially when I'm writing series and the story gets funneled into the end, you gotta make sure, really, or I guess I have to make sure that we are staying realistic, especially with what's already happened. Because if I find a plot hole like that where my characters get some random plot armor for no reason, I will be so mad. Probably happens all the time, but you know, that's for revision me to find, not for draft me to worry about right now, especially if I don't notice it. And with both of these trilogies, I am taking two different approaches to how I am drafting them, simply because this is what feels right for both projects. But for Project What, I am getting fairly far into the drafting process to a pretty solid draft before working on the next book. Like Project What was already in draft 3, printed out, ready to go before I really started Project Moss. And it's probably gonna be the same thing before I start the third book in the series. And then for Project Star, as you're probably very aware, I am drafting all 3 books at once. Well, not at once, but you know, I outlined all 3 all together. I'm drafting all 3 one at a time right after one another, sort of building the entire trilogy up at the same time. Instead of building up book 1, building up book 2, building up book 3, I want to do it all together. And so far, both processes do seem to be working quite well. I mean, Project What and Project Moss, I love those stories so much. That's my book baby. And I do think that story is turning out quite well, especially with how well established I am in the Project What universe because of how long I've been working on the first book. So I feel like that makes the story building process easier. And because I even considered making Project What a series after I finished the first draft and I was in the second draft, like in the process of creating the second draft, it just felt right to first establish the first book properly before moving on. Yeah. Funny story, Project What was supposed to be a standalone where they die in the end. All of their efforts are for naught because humanity never changes. That was the idea, the theme, the whole idea that they were on this island because of nuclear warfare, and then the book was going to end with another bomb explosion that ruins their last sort of safe haven on Earth and kills them all, and then like Earth is doomed. Right? Like humanity never learns kind of deal. Realized that there was so much more story to tell and that ending got scrapped. But that was like, I was well into draft 2 by that point, I'm pretty sure. So it just made sense to keep working on book 1 until I had a proper story with it before attempting to continue that trilogy. And then on the flip side for Project Star, I had only written the 0 draft of the first book by the time I knew it was going to be a trilogy. I mean, I kind of walked into Project Star knowing it would be a trilogy just because of how I outlined it and how it ended. It was so open-ended that it needed to continue. So by the time I knew it was going to be a trilogy, I had 1 draft sort of established and knew it could keep going beyond that. So it just felt right to work on all 3 books together since I really had no real foundation to build off of. But yeah, like I said, so new to this still. Maybe in another 3 years I can do an update and tell you guys how series writing went, tell you which one I like more, drafting them all at once or building one up at a time. For right now, I'm very much still in the thick of it for this process, so I cannot let you know anything for sure. And like I said, Project What and Project Star are the only 2 trilogies I have at the moment, or only 2 series I have at the moment. Everything else is a standalone, so maybe in the future I'll have more trilogy ideas or more series ideas besides Project Quest, rest in peace. But for right now, these are my only 2 projects that I'm really able to experiment this process on. But that is it. I told you this was going to be a long video. It's been a long video. I apologize. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out. If you have any questions about my process, because I feel like I rambled and didn't make much sense here, please leave them in the comments. I'll try and answer them the best I can. If you want to share your own process, if you do something similar to me, do something completely different to me, I would love to know. I love hearing about how different writers come up with their stories or like build up their stories, because in the end, we all technically have the same thing. We have a book, we have a novel, but to get there, no one's process is the same, and I think that's so cool. So if you have some fun, silly steps in your writing process, please let me know that as well. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.